Our last speaker for the evening is Donald Schmitt, who's the former co-director of the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, where he served as Director of Special Investigation for 10 years. Prior to that, he was a special investigator for the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek and the art director for the International UFO Reporter. Schmitt is the author of dozens of published articles about UFOs, as well as the co-author of 4 best-selling books, which includes UFO Crash at Roswell and The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. Please let me welcome to the stage Donald Schmitt.
Good evening, everyone. So, it's nap time, but we're going to go through this quickly because I have a lot of information, a lot that is not even included within the proceedings. So, excuse me, I normally don't even use notes, but because I have so many quotations, so many quotes, so many names, I'm going to go from script as I need to. And so without further ado, yet across the immense ethereal gulf, minds that to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. So begins the classic H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds. Moreover, after the famous Orson Welles radio dramatization in 1938, is there any doubt that the effect of such a scenario remained quite vivid in the minds of Americans in 1947? The late Dr. Carl Sagan often warned us Earthlings that we should refrain from announcing our existence by transmitting radio signals into space. Quote, because we do not know the intentions of a superior galactic society, end quote. Still, by the summer of 1947, the people of this world were surely unprepared by the intrusion of a phenomenon which heretofore existed solely on the pages of a science fiction novel. July 3rd of 1947, the Army Air Force stated, quote, if some foreign power is sending flying discs over the United States, it is our responsibility to know about it and take proper action, end quote. On July 4th, the press reported that military facilities along the west coast of the United States had fighters on standby in case the discs returned. July 5th, the Pentagon Army Air Force captain, Tom Brown, told Major Donald Keyhoe, United States Marine Corps, quote, we just can't ignore it. There are too many reliable pilots telling the same story. Flat, round objects able to outmaneuver ordinary planes and faster than anything we have, end quote. Brown confirmed that military facilities were on alert to investigate appearances of the flying discs. Another source told Keyhoe that some commanders had given orders to, quote, shoot the unknowns down, end quote, if possible. July 6th, an Army Air Force representative, quote, we still haven't the slightest idea what they could be. However, we don't believe anyone in this country or outside of this country has developed a guided missile, end quote. That same day, rancher W.W. Mac Brazel, outside of Roswell, New Mexico, reports the crash of a flying saucer. Army intelligence officers are sent to investigate. Major General Clements McMullen, Deputy Commander / Chief of Staff of the Strategic Air Command, orders some of the wreckage flown immediately to Washington. On July 7th, General Hoyt F. Vandenberg, Chief of Staff of the Army Air Force, had his entire day occupied by phone calls and meetings about the arrival of the discs. Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, commander of the Air Materiel Command, headquartered at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, unexpectedly flies to New Mexico. He would remain there for the next 5 days. Wright Field admitted to investigating reports of discs seen in the Pacific Northwest and in Texas at that time. On July 8th, Army Air Force intelligence was in a flurry of activity because of military sightings in California. The Chief of Requirements Intelligence Branch of the Army Air Force Intelligence, Brigadier General George F. Shulgren, brought one of the F-51 pilots from Muroc who saw, quote, a flat reflecting object at high altitude near Mount Baldy to the Pentagon for interrogation. That same morning, a special meeting was called at the Pentagon by Vandenberg of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which was chaired by electrical engineer and initiator of the Manhattan Project, Dr. Vannevar Bush. Immediately after the meeting, the Pentagon issued a press release stating that the, quote, flying saucers definitely were not spaceships. Hidden under all of these events was the public announcement by the Army about their recovery of an actual flying disc on a ranch outside of Roswell, New Mexico. That very afternoon, the Air Force also revealed it was checking out a report by C.T. Zohm, a Navy rocket engineer who, in the company of 3 other scientists, was on a secret mission in New Mexico. They observed a silvery, bright disk at low altitude moving northward across open desert. Later that afternoon, the FBI was informed that the disk brought to Carswell Army Airfield from Roswell was suspended by a balloon and was sent after transfer to the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, to Wright Field for analysis. At 6:17 p.m. Central Standard Time, the FBI Bureau Office in Dallas, Texas, refuted that claim. From Washington, the Intelligence Division of the War Department sends out the order that all of their field agents should, quote, suggest saucers are radar targets for weather observation purposes. Meanwhile, back in Roswell, rumors were escalating to a fever pitch that aliens were invading their community and were out in the street. Rancher Brazel, who first discovered the strange debris, is abducted by the military and kept in custody for the next 5 days. On July 9th, General Shulgin called the FBI and urgently requested their cooperation in solving the problem of the flying discs. At 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time that same day, Lieutenant General James Doolittle, former commander of the 8th Air Force, and General Vandenberg meet with Secretary of War for Air, Stuart Symington, Major General Leslie Groves, head of the Armed Forces Special Atomic Weapons Project, and General Robert Montague, Commander, Army Guided Missile School. They meet with Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, Deputy Chief of Air Staff for Research and Development at the Pentagon. Doolittle, who had investigated the 1946 ghost rocket phenomenon for Vandenberg and allegedly informed President Harry Truman that the objects were, quote, most likely of unknown origin, and then Vandenberg will join the meeting in progress. At 10:50 a.m., Doolittle, Vandenberg, Symington meet in the office of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Chief of Staff of the Army. Major General Loris Norstad, Director of the Plans and Operations Division of the War Department, is also present. At 11:58, Vandenberg calls President Truman. At 12:15 p.m., Doolittle and Vandenberg meet with the President. At 12:50 p.m., Vandenberg and Symington meet with the Joint Chiefs. At 2:20, Vandenberg and Symington meet again. At 2:40 p.m., Secretary of War Robert Patterson meets with Groves and Montague. And then, later that afternoon, New Mexican Senator Dennis Chavez has an unscheduled private meeting with President Harry Truman. So, you would think we had declared war. Clearly, something big had happened, something extraordinary. I go through that entire timeline just to demonstrate, does anyone believe that this is a typical day in the Oval Office of President Obama? And yet this is precisely what happened at the time that the Army Air Force has just explained away Roswell as being nothing more than a weather balloon device. As you'll read in the proceedings, the head caption is, "You would think we had gone to war." And then elsewhere around the nation at that time, banner headlines fill the morning and afternoon edition newspapers, explaining away all the excitement in the sleepy little southwestern town of Roswell. The country breathes a sigh of relief. It's merely a weather balloon device. However, some in the press were not buying it. In the years to follow, Project Blue Book would document the number of UFO sightings reported by the national media during that developing time period, beginning on June 17th, a full week before the Kenneth Arnold sighting, and then reaching the number of 157 reports alone for the day of July 6th. By July 9th, the reports had fallen off to a mere 2. Again, this is a day after the weather balloon explanation. But by July 9th, the sightings would still continue. The Las Vegas Review-Journal, along with dozens of other newspapers, carried a United Press story, quote, "Reports of flying saucers whizzing through the sky fell off sharply today as the Army and Navy began a concentrated campaign to stop the rumors," end quote. The story went on to describe that the Army Air Force, headquarters in Washington, quote, "delivered a blistering rebuke to officers at Roswell," end quote. In reality, it never happened. In fact, the base commander at Roswell, Colonel William Blanchard, would go on to become a 4-star general at the Pentagon, far from being reprimanded for making such a blunder of misidentifying a common off-the-shelf weather balloon. The Washington Post reported, quote, "At first they gave the bare details of finding the object. Then they clamped down a security lid on any further information, grounds that it was high-level stuff," end quote. And the Roswell Daily Record added, quote, "The Army isn't telling its secrets yet, from all appearances, when this was written," end quote. Now, during the next week, however, an inconsistent reaction on the part of the government began to develop. Something had happened to compel officials into complete cover-up mode, as every effort was being made to play down the situation. On its face, this was totally inconsistent with the very concept that the United States military, who is charged with the responsibility of, in the case of unknown objects reported in the sky, defending the country from the air. The Pentagon was forced to admit that they didn't have full radar coverage of the continental United States. All the more reason, pilots throughout the nation were on a 24-hour alert during this alarming situation. Unofficially, numerous pilots confirmed that they were ordered to bring down the discs if humanly possible. Foreign invaders or not, this was a scenario military personnel were highly trained for. But still, their superiors' actions displayed otherwise. The demonstrations of a staged disinterest from the highest levels of the United States government intelligence began as early as July 10th, when President Truman held a news conference and was asked about the flying discs. President Truman, when he was reminded about the situation throughout the country at that time, jokingly remarked that the situation reminded him of the notorious moon hoax of 1835, when a writer from the New York Sun published a series of articles about the discovery of people on the moon by astronomer Sir John Herschel. And the articles were written as satire. So here the president was totally downplaying the whole flying disc situation. And just as scripted was a July 10th El Paso radio interview of Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force, who had just identified the Roswell disc at a press conference in Carswell Airfield Base in Fort Worth. When the radio announcer asked about all the other flying disc reports throughout the country, Ramey joked that that was true, except for Kansas, as he would add, which is a dry state. The discrediting of the subject and those who would continue reporting them to the authorities was going into high gear. Over the next 5 days, around the nation, the Pentagon instructed the Army to demonstrate launches of the radar weather balloon devices to the press and how they could account for many of the flying disc reports. Contrary to the public perception, military and FBI agents were hard at work, even as the numbers of reports dropped because of the concerted effort to downplay and ridicule witnesses. Sightings continued, but fear of public embarrassment was a great deterrent to reporting them. Still, the major concern was obvious on the part of officialdom, that this phenomenon was indeed a dangerous threat to national security. However, as the days of July proceeded, both military and civilian intelligence agencies became aware of a bewildering silence from the Pentagon, where there had first been extreme urgency and pressure from the highest levels of authority for answers. Suddenly, there was silence. Finally, after getting all their field operatives in place and data under control, nothing. One was led to believe that someone at the top had discovered what indeed was behind the mystery. The wall of silence had shut out even the highest office of intelligence in the Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel C.G.D. Garrett, who served directly under Shulgin, agreed with FBI agent, Special Agent S.W. Reynolds, that the discs were probably, quote, a very highly classified experiment of the Army or Navy, end quote. A scientist attached to the Air Force intelligence had reached a similar conclusion. Quote, Colonel Garrett stated, "We have reported sightings of unknown objects over the United States." And the high brass appeared to be totally unconcerned. He indicated this led him to believe that they knew enough about these objects to express no concern, end quote. Now, after vouching for the reliability of the reporters of these unknowns, Garrett concluded, quote, "There are objects seen which somebody in the government knows about," end quote. However, if Air Force intelligence wasn't being told what the discs were, who was? Reynolds followed up this conversation with a visit to his contact at the War Department, Colonel L.R. Forney. Forney assured Reynolds that he had inquired about secret Army projects to his superiors, and the Army had no idea what the objects were. Garrett subsequently addressed his boss, Shulgin, about Air Force projects and got the same response. But perhaps Shulgin didn't know everything that the Air Force research and development was doing. The FBI and the Air Force agreed with Shulgin that he should send a query further up the corridors of Secretary of Secrecy to General Curtis LeMay, head of Research and Development. The response given to the FBI on September 5th of 1947 was that, quote, "A complete survey of research activities discloses that the Army Air Force had no project with the characteristics similar to those which had been associated with the flying discs," end quote. Navy Admiral Calvin Bolster, Chief of Aeronautics Research on Experimental Aircraft, expressed the same ignorance for their own part, in the ongoing puzzle. Nevertheless, the FBI remained concerned that this was like chasing ghosts. No answers, just questions. Shulgin's staff, tired of being out of the loop, decided to make a direct request of the commanding general at Wright Field and its own secret project, testing labs, for an official statement on the new phenomenon, on whether further intelligence activity was warranted. Along with his request, General Twining received the intelligence community's very first estimate of the nature of UFOs, quote, "A detailed study of reports selected for their impression of veracity and reliability," end quote. Unfortunately, the same could hardly be said about the actual study, entitled Analysis of Flying Disc Reports. The UFO investigations conducted by the Army Air Force Intelligence were disorganized, unprofessional, and confused in July of 1947. The report also displayed that the Army Air Force was not sharing all of its data with the Air Materiel Command. This applies to General Shulgin's office and the semi-independent base operatives scattered throughout the United States. Whatever was going on at Wright Field, behind closed doors, may have been entirely a different matter, but the public investigation was inept. The report illustrated a total lack of direction and would not even qualify as a cursory report. The summary document was incomplete even though the investigators were willing to let people like Shulgin, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and ultimately Twining to examine it. The investigators showed total inefficiency in interviewing principal witnesses. A number of incident dates were wrong, which would tend to suggest that such cases were never even looked into. What remains most suspicious are the strange omissions of some of the most important incidents that had drawn all of the concern in the first place. Why the mediocrity on the part of the Air Force, Army Air Force investigators? This report was not put together with any greater intensity because the authors did not feel it was necessary. They did not believe the discs were any great mystery. It was obvious to them that UFOs were mechanical aerial devices, but the indications were clear. Despite the assurances to the contrary, they must be U.S. designed technology. General Twining's response, dated September 23rd, 1947, must have shocked nearly everyone in Air Force intelligence outside of Wright Field, especially General Shulgin, who expected to hear that everything was under control and that it was our classified aircraft. Far from recommending that future inquiry be suspended, Twining elevated the concern to an official, centralized, secret project to gather UFO information. More importantly, it was not only censored from the public and the media, but also from the very intelligence agents in the field collecting the data on the true nature of the new phenomenon. So the July 30th Air Force estimate was handed up to Twining, who, after consulting with technical experts at Wright Field, essentially handed it back to Shulgin. The following conclusions about the nature of UFOs were in Twining's letter. And most of you are aware of this, any of you who are students as far as to the subject of UFOs. And in Twining's letter where he stated, "The phenomenon is something real and not hallucinatory, hoaxed, or misperceived natural phenomenon. Something is really flying around. The surface of the objects is metallic or made of some other reflective substance. The objects rarely leave a trail except perhaps in high-performance operations. The objects are circular or elliptical, flat on the bottom with a low dome on top. Flights may occur in well-ordered, well-kept formations in numbers of 3 to 9 disks. Speeds are estimated at over 300 knots. And finally, sizes are estimated to be as large as man-made aircraft. What is not generally known, even within UFO circles, is that at the end of the letter, handwritten, is the listing of high-ranking officers and scientists who coordinated the very memo, specifically from the aircraft propeller, power plant labs, the engineering division, T3 at Wright Field. All the handwritten notations. Now, why would General Twining be consulting with air mechanical engineers regarding the true nature of the flying discs, unless they actually had something to work with, unless they actually had first-hand information? After full consultation with these people, his lead aeronautical engineers at Wright Field had essentially said, "The phenomenon is real and it isn't ours." Therefore, Twining clearly demonstrated his knowledge of the reality of flying saucers. What did the general know that his intelligence advisors did not have access to? What had happened during that time, which forced the top brass at the Pentagon and Wright Field to put such a definitive statement as to acknowledge the reality of UFOs? Mind you, this conclusion was arrived at all within the course of a few months. As described, investigations prior to that, as far as on the part of the field agents, was totally lackluster. Photographic evidence was rare, and most sightings went unattended. Only physical evidence could have provided incontrovertible proof. Only an event such as the recovery of such physical evidence and a weather balloon would hardly fit that criteria. Clearly, something extraordinary had happened in New Mexico just 2 months before Twining's amazing assessment. In addition, where had the wreckage from the alleged flying saucer crash been taken? Wright Field, where General Twining was headquartered. So he would have had direct access, and remember, he had also spent 5 days in New Mexico at the time of the incident. Now, something that journalists and researchers tend to forget when appraising the U.S. military intelligence activities is that basically the only thing that these agencies are concerned with is national security. Every action taken by the military, by military officers, and projects must be viewed primarily in that context. If we continually ask ourselves, is there any potential threat to U.S. security in this scenario, then we will understand the beginnings of the logic preceding Twining's admission. Shogun's Air Intelligence Requirements Division put out their own call to arms. And on July 28th of 1947, a secret Air Intelligence Requirements Division 5-page draft of collection memorandum listing the current intelligence requirements in the field of flying saucer type aircraft. Now, especially noteworthy is requirement number 3, item of construction. A, type of material, whether metal, ferrous, non-ferrous, or non-metallic. B, composite or sandwich construction, utilizing various combinations of metals, metallic foils, plastics, and perhaps balsa wood or similar materials. C, unusual fabrication methods to achieve extreme lightweight and structural stability. Under power plant, the draft request states, information is needed regarding the propulsion system of the aircraft being the flying discs. The presence of an unconventional or unusual type of propulsion system cannot be ruled out and should be considered of great interest. Now, what is quite telling is the degree of detail that could hardly have been advanced from observing distant objects in the sky. Is there any doubt that these particular descriptions closely resemble the eyewitness accounts from Roswell? Again, specifically, the descriptions of the material recovered at Roswell. The lightweight, the near indestructible material, the memory materials, the materials that even though you couldn't cut or bend, and yet you could crumble and crease in your hands, and they would flow like water once you would lay it down to a smooth surface. And that's exactly the same type of materials that the Air Intelligence Requirements Division is requesting information about 3 months after the incident. So the question remains, how are researchers to interpret the old order, the general Twinings, not sharing the new technology with the new? The low-level alertness allowed American research projects to move forward under a cloak of secrecy. The Cold War between the two superpowers was placing all field agents on standard alert, and the arrival of the flying discs only raised the level of suspicion at a time when national security was becoming a code phrase for lack of public disclosure. And we hear it up to this day. Whenever we don't have a need to know, well, it involves national security. Don't ask because it's a threat to national security. The apparent invasion of UFOs over America was akin to someone launching a first assault. We just didn't know who to counterattack. So highlighting this near chaos comes the mysterious Roswell crash of an advanced object in the first week of July of 1947. It was recovered by the United States military and promptly engulfed in secrecy. If this device were extraterrestrial, its recovery would certainly change the atmosphere in U.S. intelligence circles. For discussion purposes, we will assume the craft was manufactured off the planet. Then, we ask the national security question again. On one hand, the answer would be relief that the Soviets were not responsible. However, the alien nature of the craft would not remove the Russians from the national security question. Pentagon and Wright Field authorities needed to shut this discovery down to absolute secrecy so that the Soviets wouldn't find out anything, wouldn't find out as far as any of the potential technology, which immediately created a need-to-know situation within the U.S. government. Now, none of the personnel in intelligence below the very top would be informed. If any information was disclosed at all, it typically was disinformation. The less people knowing the facts, the less chance the information could be leaked, stolen, or compromised. The potential for new military advances and breakthroughs were at stake, which, when added to their atomic superiority, could place the United States as the lone superpower in the world in 1947. Now, despite Roswell, life for all of those aware of this ultimate secret went on its desperate pace. From their vantage point, the concern was focused almost entirely on identifying the craft of unknown origin. And the Soviets took a back seat to the level of secrecy surrounding the crash. The silence from the top had begun, permeating the atmosphere of early to mid-July of 1947. Almost all of this, except the extraterrestrial reality of Roswell, is documented in controversial sources. However, allow us to pull back the curtain and speculate what would have transpired under the veil of U.S. national security. If Roswell happened, was alien, and was recovered for study, what would be the procedural focus? National security concerns would now coincide with scientific up to a certain point. Any knowledge harnessed from the debris field, could open the door through reverse engineering. Materials beyond comprehension and the manner in which specific alloys were arranged at the molecular level and the manner in which specific alloys were arranged would be unprecedented and would serve as a quantum leap in the history of mankind. Nevertheless, terrestrial science of 1947 might not have been able to comprehend this advanced technology of materials, just as alien as the very crew which piloted that craft. It would be fair to conclude that little, if any, headway was made in any reverse engineering. If you can't plug it in, you can't get it to work. Today, after over 60 years, it appears likely that the United States Air Force really got nowhere on what it really wanted to know about the craft and how the materials were structured. They were unable to determine how the device functioned, what the intentions of the visitors were, and where they originated. Is it any wonder that by the fall of 1947, nothing was trickling down from the highest levels of the military? There was nothing to disclose. They were forced to concede that they were likely years from any answers. It was during the post-Roswell period that pressure was applied again for the intelligence community to go underground and then come up with UFO information that would help the Pentagon comprehend their enigma. Its focus was at Wright Field. UFO investigations would be conducted from there. And after all, too much of the media was focused on Washington and the Pentagon. Dayton was out in the suburbs as far as they were concerned. And the military elite still needed breathing room to get a handle on the UFO situation. Therefore, the intelligence community found itself taking the subject serious again, but not chasing flying discs in the sky, but rather collecting both domestic and foreign information from lookout posts throughout the free world, with the intent of still solving the UFO mystery in prosaic terms. Whereas the projects associated with Roswell, the Roswell crash, knew what they had, but could not acknowledge what they could not comprehend. All of which left little, if not impossible, chances of reverse engineering. Of course, the irony remained that the Soviets would remain just as much in the dark. Without solid answers, even with physical proof in hand, sightings would never provide anything beyond confirmation. In addition, even as much as national security was a single driving force behind the initial secrecy. After 3 years, the phenomenon has not shown any interest in ever landing at the White House front lawn. True, something extremely sinister and alarming may be brewing beneath the surface if we are to take any of the so-called abduction accounts seriously. But that will have to remain another topic. So, after 3 years, they were still demonstrating. They were still just as much in the dark over the flying disc, the UFO situation, as they were in July of 1947. Now, assuming that our visitors themselves do not eventually announce their existence, do we have much hope that the United States government might reveal what it knows or lack thereof? Personally, as observed with the growing list of Roswell explanations alone, now we're up to 4, I foresee no change in their policy, as evidenced by the fact that since the end of 1948, the government has done all it can to downplay and even ridicule the subject, all of which suggests the very gist of what still lies behind the greatest cover-up in the history of mankind. The dilemma remains for the secret keepers after countless attempts at solving the endless debate of who, why, and from where. It's still a cover-up of ignorance. There is nothing to disclose because there are still no answers. True, physical evidence has been in government hands since it all began, but the unknown craft came with no owner's manual. We still cannot make it fly. That in itself should demonstrate just how much we do not know about our celestial borders. We have an advanced technology. Drop one of their devices right in our lap, and we cannot even find the on button. It was due to this clandestine reaction on the arrival of the flying saucer phenomenon in the summer of 1947 that records of the early years of the Air Force's investigation were either destroyed or remain secret. We are forever grateful to the late Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was the first director of Project Blue Book, who had access to this unknown history. For example, he was the first to disclose the Twining letter that confirmed the existence of the UFO phenomenon in the first place. But more importantly, the officer, Major Ruppelt, Captain Ruppelt, painted the true picture of exactly what was going on at all of the smoke-filled meetings in Washington and at Wright Field in 1947. In his own book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, he stated, I quote, "By the end of July of 1947, the UFO security lid was down tight. The few members of the press who did inquire about what the Air Force was doing got the same treatment that you would get today if you inquired about the number of thermonuclear weapons stockpiled in the U.S. atomic arsenal. At the Air and Technical Intelligence Center, there was confusion to the point of panic." End quote. Now, what was truly what has truly become comical is the notion that the Pentagon's alarm was over something as trivial as a weather balloon. On the other hand, maybe it was time-traveling wooden crash dummies. Or for an added threat, let's throw in 13-year-old mutant Russian children, and we can thank Annie Jacobsen for that enlightenment. July of 1947 also saw the passage of the National Security Act, the official establishment of the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Department of Defense, all within a couple of weeks after the balloon explanation was accepted by the national media, and the summer silly season could resume unabated. People's interests once again debated the hemlines from French fashion designers, and flying discs were just nothing more than hot air. An international news service quoted the public relations officer at Wright Field stating, quote, "So far, we haven't found anything to confirm that saucers exist. We don't think they are guided missiles. As things go are now, they appear to be either a phenomenon or a figment of somebody's imagination," end quote. And so, the earth was once again saved, but not from an outside invader, but rather its own insecurities, post-war jitters, if you please. Nevertheless, the wreckage and bodies recovered at Roswell haunted the eyewitnesses, but also those whose utmost responsibility was to defend our country. If not for any overt directness on the part of the visitors, a true sense of helplessness must have permeated the halls of the Pentagon and Wright Field back in those days. Recall how General Twining rushed to New Mexico to, as he stated in a letter to the director at the Boeing aircraft plant in Kansas City, quote, "A very important sudden matter developed here," end quote. And like most of his subordinates, his own son, Nathan Jr., here to your left, would have to learn the truth about Roswell from his father's most trusted aides. Twining knew that the world would never be the same, so why place such a burden on his own family? In fact, his son fondly describes how often his father referred to his men, his personnel at Wright Field, as his boys. After 65 years, we are still asking the same questions. Even more reason that we remind ourselves why the UFO phenomenon remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the world. Just as relevant is the associated point that Ruppelt attempted to make when he asked, quote, "What constitutes proof? Does a UFO have to land at the river entrance to the Pentagon near the Joint Chiefs of Staff office? Or is it proof when a ground radar station detects a UFO, sends a jet to intercept it, the jet pilot sees it, locks on his radar, only to have the UFO streak away at phenomenal speed," end quote. Our mistake was that we allowed the government to redefine what proof is. For the UFO community, they keep raising the bar. And for them, the response continues, what bar? We have long realized that all the evidence in the world won't change those with an agenda of debunking UFOs. The crime remains that in 1947, the evidence arrived, and a handful of individuals decided for each and every generation since. Some might argue that due to their unique mindset following the Great War, that they had the masses' best interest at heart. They had the new superweapon that just ended World War II at their sole disposal. Military technology was taking off, and public confidence in elected officials was at an all-time high. No one could have imagined that within 2 short years they would have been forced to deal with powers that were totally beyond their earthly control. In the public eye, the military had always saved the world from any worldly threat. But this was something of science fiction. Ruppelt summed up the situation at that time based on his premise that the military needs answers, not mysteries. To quote Ruppelt, before, if an interesting report came in and they wanted an answer, all they'd get was it would be real, but we can't prove it, end quote. Ruppelt would also refer to this developing period as the Dark Ages. Everything was going in, but nothing was coming out. And the Air Force theorem at that time was, it can't be, therefore it isn't. And Ruppelt would add, everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs couldn't exist. Historically, all of their actions clearly demonstrate a reaction to something truly extraordinary. Panic may indeed have been the overriding emotion from the very people who up until 1947 were riding high in the aftermath of World War II. National security takes an entirely new definition because the old rules no longer apply. Moreover, the new anomaly was writing new rules, including redefining the very laws of physics. The late Roswell base adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Saunders, confessed to his own family just before dying in 1995, quote, "We were faced with a technology greater than ours. We had no idea what their intentions might be," end quote. One of the most important rocket scientists and the champion of modern-day space exploration was Dr. Wernher von Braun of Germany. He was also the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, which successfully put our Apollo astronauts on the moon. It can be documented that von Braun was in Roswell on a number of occasions at the time of the 1947 crash. He would later state in 1959, quote, "We find ourselves faced by powers which are far stronger than we had heretofore assumed, and whose base of operation is at present unknown to us," end quote. Again, cover up of ignorance. The next time one of the SETI scientists dismiss UFOs and then defend the relevance of their own jobs, they had better take a course in national security and then heed the dire advice of one of their own colleagues. When noted space scientist and mathematician Dr. Albert Hibbs of Caltech's Jet Propulsion Laboratory was asked, how should we reply to the very first message from another planet he sternly answered, quote, "Hang up. Look what happened to the Indians." End quote, and I thank you. We're all out of time, so that's fine.